First of all, I want to welcome everyone to October's webinar lecture. We are kicking off spooky season, not with monsters in the paranormal sense, but in the true crime world. And today's Lunch and Learn, we will focus on deadly doctors and their crimes and motivations. As the title suggests, this is a true crime event, so that's what we're going to be discussing. A little bit of housekeeping before we begin. My name is Kim Giovanelli. I am the executive director here at the Lancaster Medical Heritage Museum. We are a 501c3 nonprofit charity, and we do these lectures about once a month, depending on if we have individuals who are able to do them. I want to say that if you are interested in doing one, or if you have an idea for one, please feel free to reach out to us. We are starting to schedule for next year. This is the last one of this year. So if you have any ideas, please reach out to us at info@lancastermedicalheritagemuseum.org. As I mentioned, I have muted everyone. So any questions you might have going forward, please put them in the chat and I will answer them at the end. So before we begin, it's really important to start with a disclaimer. There will be discussions of murder and harm and other crimes in this lecture. So if that is unnerving for you, please use your own discretion. It's also very important to know that, so sorry guys, hold on a second. There we go. So it's important to note that neither myself, the presenter, nor the Lancaster Medical Heritage Museum believes that all doctors or nurses are guilty of the acts that we will be discussing. The overwhelming majority stick to the creed to do no harm. So, what makes someone act the way they do? What are the motivations behind a dirty doctor? We can pretend to understand what the motivations behind serial killings are, but the fact of the matter is that we will never truly know. Many who commit these atrocities lie, cheat, and manipulate for their own gain, so it's harder to muddle through when trying to pinpoint. There are, however, speculations. When it comes to dastardly doctors, there are usually a few titles we may think of, them being the angel of death or the angel of mercy. This specifically refers to a medical professional who believes that they are doing the right thing when murdering a patient, essentially being merciful or ending suffering. But that really only covers one motivation. Uncovering the complex motivations behind criminal behavior prompts us to question what drives individuals to commit these acts. So, when it comes to medical professionals, experts have actually identified three specific motivations. One we mentioned previously, the angel of death, the angel of mercy. But that's not to say that this is set in stone, as motivation is an individualized thing in any human. What motivates us to do one thing versus another? Why do some kill and some don't? So the three identified as part of the medical professional persona in a doctor or nurse who kills is sadism, mercy killing, and the malignant hero. I briefly touch on all three of those so you can get an idea of what they are and what they mean. So firstly, there's sadism. In the case of sadistic or sadism killings with regards to medical professionals, they tend to utilize their position to exert power or control over helpless victims. They abuse authority for dominance and exploit their position to manipulate and influence and ultimately harm. Some might think it's for their own personal pleasure, a lack of power or control in their personal lives that then is just translated into murder or harm. But as mentioned, all motivations, including this one, vary. The second identified type is that of the mercy killing or the mercy killer. This is the one we most typically think of when the idea of a medical professional who purposefully kills a patient comes up. This is when the professional has the delusion that they are helping by putting a suffering patient out of their misery, and it stems from a belief that only they can save their victim by ending their life. The final motivation is that of the malignant hero. This individual purposefully and knowingly endangers a victim's life and may even fake attempt resuscitation in order to be seen as selflessly making an effort, even though the perpetrator is well aware that the victim may be dead or beyond help due to their own actions. Whoop, too far. The motivations for this are a want of attention and to be seen as a hero. They get off on the idea that they have done all that they can as selflessly as necessary, even though they are the ones who caused the damage in the first place. So now we're getting on to the meat of everything. The historical examples of doctors and nurses that kill. Again, please note, these individuals do not represent the vast majority of doctors and nurses. They are outliers who have intentionally hurt, killed, and/or swindled patients, either for personal gain or sick satisfaction. So first, and probably the most famous of the subjects that we're going to examine, is considered America's first serial killer, Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. In his day, Dr. Holmes was considered a decently good-looking dude and a charismatic man. But as we discuss his life, you'll see that he's far from just charismatic or good-looking. He's also a polygamist, a swindler, a kidnapper, and a murderer. As we go through, I will give brief stats for everyone that we discuss. And here's the brief breakdown for Holmes. He was born Herman Webster Mudgett in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, but attended medical school at the University of Michigan School of Medicine. This is where he learned about using cadavers to fake deaths and to collect fraudulent insurance money, something he would continue to do throughout his life, only the cadavers were then changed to his victims. During this time period, it would have been a lot easier for someone to do something along this lines, as we had no real means of communication like we do today. There was no social media, there was no internet, there was few and far between with regards to phone and electricity. So it would be easy to do something like this, far easier than it is now. Holmes's primary hunting grounds were Chicago and Philadelphia, but ultimately he traveled a lot, so it varies, as do his methods of killing. He was only convicted of one murder, but he's suspected that there are 20 to 200 total victims that he has killed. He was even suspected of being Jack the Ripper, as he was an American doctor in London in the right time frame, and many witnesses suspected a potential American doctor. If anybody remembers, about 5 years or so, there was a History Channel documentary that came out about this very specific thing, with his great-grandson even exhuming the body. But unfortunately, this is something we just will never know. And we can't talk about Dr. Holmes without talking about the 1893 Chicago World's Fair and the infamous murder castle, both of which are pictured here. And if the likes of H.H. Holmes during this time frame and how Chicago inevitably beat out the likes of New York and Philadelphia for the World's Exposition interests you, I really highly, highly recommend Eric Larson's book, Devil in the White City. But as it goes, I won't be getting too far into the World's Fair, only as it relates to Holmes. But incidentally, this is where Ferris debuted his famous wheel, which is pictured there on the right. It was also where a killer discovered a scheme to kill for profit and pleasure in unique and terrifying ways. So from May 5th to October 31st, 1893, 27 million visitors descended on the city of Chicago. to see the new wonders of the world. I already mentioned Ferris, but there was also the introduction of the automatic dishwasher, the zipper, and the Parliament of the World's Religions, where for the first time, members of Eastern and Western religions met in a formal gathering. And it's among this backdrop that we actually find H.H. Holmes preying on his victims that may or may not be missed. And I already mentioned that this is a time period before computers and social media and even widespread telephone or electricity usage. So it was easy to disappear. Just look at the crowds in these photos and you can see just how crowded this actually was in this small town, essentially. Chicago was not the town it is now at this point. And it's here that we actually find our infamous murder castle. So you've heard me mention Holmes's murder castle a few times now and might think, gee, that seems excessive. Well, let me tell you, that doesn't even scratch the surface. So shortly after arriving in Chicago, Holmes began working at a pharmacy near Jackson Park, which is also called the Englewood section of the city. Holmes began working at a pharmacy there, and hold on, I got a little tongue-tied there. So Holmes began working at a pharmacy near Jackson Park, and then 8 years later, Jackson Park would hold the 1893 World's Fair. And Holmes inevitably capitalized on this influx of visitors, including and especially young women seeking employment at the fairgrounds. So historians believe Holmes, a skilled and charismatic con artist, had defrauded not only his drugstore employees, potentially even killing them, as nobody really knows what happened to them. The women who came to work for him, also potentially killing them. But he also purchased this empty lot where he constructed a complex building with shops on the ground floor and apartments above. It's well known that Holmes defrauded those tasked to build the castle, quote unquote, usually firing them after a few weeks and refusing to pay for spotty work. The rumor states that he did this so no one would know the true layout of the building, because Holmes's murder castle, as it became known later, was a labyrinthine structure with soundproof rooms, gas chambers, hidden passages, trap doors, and confusing hallways. Sensationalists report that the booby trap doors were actually body chutes that led to the basement. And rumor had it that he would use these bodies, articulate them, and sell them to medical schools for profit. So after all of that, what actually became of H.H. Holmes? Holmes was arrested in 1893 after fleeing Chicago. He was accused of murdering his assistant, Benjamin Peitzel, in an insurance scheme gone wrong, and as well as his children, while collecting the insurance money on all of them, while also defrauding Peitzel's wife. He was later convicted of killing Peitzel, but not the children. So while in prison, Holmes wrote an autobiography in which he claimed, "I could not help the fact that I was a murderer." His story was later popularized in the book that I previously recommended, The Devil in the White City. Holmes was hanged in 1896 at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia, and he's actually buried at Holy Cross Cemetery in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, just outside of Philadelphia. That also happens to be my hometown, and my great-grandparents are actually buried in that cemetery as well. So we'll leave Dr. H.H. Holmes with a quote from his autobiography, part of which I have already read. "I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than the poet can help the inspiration to sing." For Holmes, motivations vary, but his primary goal was monetary. How could he benefit financially with no regard for who he hurt? And we would probably give him the sadist category of motivations. However, as famous, or rather infamous, as he became, he's really only the beginning. We'll move on to Dr. Death, Dr. Harold Shipman, a much more recent example. So like Holmes, I'll give you a few stats. He was born Harold Frederick Shipman in Nottingham, Nottinghamshire, England, and attended the University of Leeds Medical School, where he became a GP or general practitioner. We would probably call them a family doctor today. Not today, in the United States. We call them family doctors anyway. He has a confirmed body count of 218, but he was only convicted of 15 of those. And he was suspected of as many as 250 victims. He used diamorphine to kill his victims, using that to overdose. Diamorphine is also known as heroin and is prescribed in the United Kingdom for severe pain, including post-surgery and end-of-life care. It can be administered through various methods, including injection and nasal spray. And in 2004, guidelines recommended using diamorphine for post-cesarean pain relief. Harold Shipman was addicted to this, and this is what he used to kill his estimated 250 victims. Using this method, he overdosed his patients, sometimes after fraudulently getting into the will or manipulating the medical records, and quickly signed death certificates, and became possibly the most prolific serial killer in modern history. So, sorry, guys. There we go. So what happened to Dr. Death? So this is going to be a lot, so just bear with me here a second. So in 1998, Dr. Linda Reynolds of Brook Surgery, a surgery is like a doctor's office, expressed concerns to the coroner about the unusually high death rate among Shipman's patients, particularly elderly women. She noticed a suspicious pattern of cremation forms for these patients, which made it really difficult to determine the cause of death, which is why he was only convicted of 15 and not 250 that he was suspected of. Unfortunately, despite Dr. Reynolds' concerns, police were unable to gather enough evidence to charge Shipman. And the case was unfortunately closed, but inexperience was later cited as the reason for the case being closed, which really doesn't feel right to me, and I'm sure it doesn't feel right to you. And following this closed investigation, Shipman went on to kill 3 more people. A few months later, taxi driver John Shaw reported his suspicions about Shipman to the police, believing he had murdered 21 patients. Because Shaw became suspicious, many of his elderly passengers, who appeared healthy, died while in Shipman's care. Shipman's last victim, Kathleen Grundy, who is pictured here at the bottom, was a former mayor, and she was found dead at her home in 1998. Shipman was the last person to see her alive. Angela Woodruff, Grundy's daughter, became suspicious when a new will appeared, excluding her and her children, but leaving a large sum of money to Shipman. So she went to the police as anyone would, and Grundy's body was exhumed. Traces of diamorphine were found in her body, even though she had no history of pain management. Shipman, when asked, claimed that she was an addict, but police found evidence that he had forged the medical records after her death. Shipman was arrested in 1998 after being suspected of forging the will, like I mentioned, and police investigated his involvement in other patients' deaths and discovered a pattern of administering lethal doses of diamorphine, falsifying medical records, and signing death certificates. In 2000, Shipman was found guilty of murdering 15 women, some of which are pictured here, but not all, and was sentenced to life in prison. Shipman committed suicide in 2004, leaving his victims' families feeling really cheated and frustrated. His deaths did spark a debate about the effectiveness of whole life sentencing and the state of the United Kingdom's prisons. But the question remains, was justice served for the victims pictured and many more? That's a hard question to answer, but in my opinion, I would say no. You may feel differently. Shipman, like Holmes, probably leans toward the sadistic killer with a foot in the angel of death category, sometimes stating that his patients were close to death and needed his help. We're going to move on to another older example. We're going to kind of go back and forth. So we're going to discuss the Prince of Poisons, Dr. William Palmer. He was born in Ridgely, Staffordshire, England in August of 1824, and at the age of 17, he began work as a chemist's apprentice. So during this time, chemist would be the pharmacy. So he was essentially a pharmacy apprentice. But he was dismissed under suspicion of theft and embezzlement. He later moved to London to study medicine, where he qualified. I still can't believe he actually qualified as a doctor. But in 1846, he qualified as a doctor at the age of 22, and he moved back to his hometown, which is where he opened his practice. He was officially convicted of murdering only one, but was suspected of killing his mother-in-law and several of his children, as well as potentially others by strychnine poisoning. Come on, there it goes. So, as mentioned previously, he qualified as a doctor, but it was well known that he preferred gambling and horses to helping the sick. And while he did get married, he was also well known to like other women. He was a bit of a philanderer, and he even had a child with one of his servants. Enter John Cook. John Cook was a friend of Palmer, though I use that term extremely loosely. Cook was a wealthy but sickly man who enjoyed betting on horses with Palmer. This will be important later. And for some backstory, the previous day, Palmer had been visited by some nefarious individuals who threatened to, quote, pay a visit to his mother to pay back some debts if Palmer didn't do so immediately. So the following day, when he went to the horse track with John Cook, he bet extremely heavily on the horses, but lost it all. John Cook, however, ended up winning a hefty sum of £3,000. This would be the equivalent of winning $14,610 today, pounds today, and that's $19,177. So it was nothing to sneeze at. After the big win, Palmer and Cook went to the pub called the Raven. Here they drank and they partied to celebrate the win by Cook. And even at this point, John Cook was complaining that the gin he was drinking tasted funny. He said it burnt his throat. Palmer made sure to make a big to-do, a big stink about how Cook's glass was fine and that there was absolutely nothing wrong with the gin he was drinking. Yet, John Cook was violently ill that night. And he's known to have told two friends, quote, I believe that damn Palmer has been dosing me, end quote. Yet, even after all that, Cook still went out drinking with Palmer on November 17th. Just like before, Cook began to get ill, and at this point, Palmer took responsibility for John Cook as his doctor. His solicitor, or his legal counsel, sent over a bottle of gin in hopes that it would help Cook get better. Keep in mind, this is the middle of the 1800s and medicine was a bit off. Palmer basically force-fed Cook the rest of the bottle of gin that he had definitely tampered with, until John Cook again became violently ill. At this point, Palmer began accepting bets on John Cook's behalf, definitely pocketing the money for himself. And you have to wonder what is going through John Cook's mind. He has to be suspicious of Palmer, and we know this from the previous quote. Yet after Palmer went to a pharmacist and acquired grains of strychnine that he put into 2 pills, John Cook still took those pills. He died in agony at 1 a.m. the same day. So I'm saying here's where it gets weird, but this whole situation is just weird to begin with. After Cook's death, a post-mortem was conducted, an autopsy. Palmer not only interfered with the examination, but he even tried to bribe the coroner. And oddly, the medical examiner found no evidence of poison, but believed Cook was poisoned, which was enough that Palmer was immediately suspected, was arrested, and was tried at the Old Bailey in England, which is pictured here. So the Old Bailey is a nickname given to the Central Criminal Court in London. Here he was found guilty of the death of John Cook and was hanged for his crime before a crowd of thousands. And one particularly famous onlooker was Charles Dickens himself, and he called Palmer the greatest villain that ever stood. In my opinion, Dr. William Palmer would fall under the sadism category, which is what you'll see a lot. He harmed anyone that stood in his way with no remorse or feeling about it. So now I'm going to go on to Nurses That Kill. He is going to be our last sort of subject we're going to talk about. I could do this presentation 10 times over and still be able to give more examples of doctors and nurses that kill. In fact, I had to edit myself to keep this within 45 minutes so that it's time for questions at the end. But it should come as no surprise that doctors are not the only ones to harm others, because they're not the only ones with access to patients. Nurses are also have access to patients. So we're going to talk about Niles Hogel. Please pardon my pronunciations of a lot of this. This is set in Germany, and I don't speak German, so I apologize if I am butchering any of these names and places. But Niles Hogel will be our ultimate example of the malignant hero motivation, and you'll see why as I get into the story. And I'm a little surprised he's not more well known based on what he's actually done. So Niles Hogel was born December 30th of 1976 in Wilhelmshaven, Germany. He was the son of a nurse, his father, and he followed in those footsteps, becoming a nurse himself and completing his training in 1997 at the Sankt Willehad Hospital, where he continued to work as a nurse. Once he moved to, So in 1999, he actually moved to the Oldenburg Clinic, and he was there until 2002. And he worked as a nurse in the cardiac surgery intensive care unit, where instances of resuscitations and deaths spiked almost immediately. An investigation found that 58% of these incidents happened while he was on duty. After the investigation, Hogel took a 3-week sick leave where only 3 patients died during this time. And he only took that 3-week sick leave because he believed that he had been caught, which he told police much later after he was arrested. So after this incident, he was transferred to anesthesiology, where the pattern continued and a spike of deaths and emergency situations continued. After being confronted many times by the head physician, Hogel was given 2 options: either resign with full pay or transfer to a different department. The physician's hope was that he would have less access to patients and medical situations, and that he might simply just be moving them around, but this would not be the case. He did choose to transfer, and surprisingly received a glowing letter of recommendation from the head nurse on duty, who stated that he had completed assigned tasks to, quote, the utmost satisfaction. In December of 2002, he was transferred to the Delmenhorst Clinic. Again, I apologize for the pronunciations. Where the same pattern began almost immediately. The emergencies and fatalities were mostly due to arrhythmia or a sudden decrease in blood pressure. And I do know that there are some doctors in the lecture right now, so please feel free to correct me if I am wrong on any of this, as I am not a doctor. So Hogel was on duty for many of these, which caused many of his coworkers to begin distancing themselves from him. It was initially reported that Hogel was held in high regard at Delmenhorst until suspicions began to get higher. It was alleged that his superiors probably suspected him, but did not act on the suspicions, even after 4 empty vials of ajmaline, is what I'm going to call it because I cannot pronounce that first word, surfaced in Hogel's ward, even though no doctor had prescribed it at the time. For some context, ajmaline also has other trade names, but I'm not going to try and pronounce them, is a medication used to identify a heart condition called Brugada syndrome. People with Brugada syndrome have an increased risk of irregular heartbeats, which can be dangerous. So ajmaline works by causing these irregular heartbeats, which people with Brugada syndrome are more susceptible to and can be seen on an electrocardiogram or an ECG. And that shows the change in the electrical activity of the heart. So now imagine you were given a heavy dose of this, even though you have no history of Brugada syndrome. Nobody has prescribed it to be given to you, and you have no idea why you're being given it. You can imagine how it would cause an emergency situation. But why? We always ask the question, why? Why do people do what they do? Well, with Hogel, we do have an answer. In 2019, a forensic psychiatrist evaluation, well after he had been arrested, diagnosed him with a combination personality disorder characterized by narcissistic, antisocial, and compulsive traits. He exhibited a strong need for attention and admiration, often acting in an overly dramatic or theatrical manner. He craved excitement and thrills and showed a remarkable lack of empathy for others. He felt no guilt, no shame, no remorse, and the likelihood of successful therapy was deemed very low. On top of all of this, he had a long history of alcohol and painkiller abuse. He had even admitted to killing an additional 3 patients after his daughter was born in order to sustain, quote, sustain this euphoria, this feeling of happiness, end quote. So now you can see why we call him the malignant hero. If you remember back to our early slides, he is basically the definition. So what happens when the malignant hero gets caught? In June 2005, a suspicious incident involving a patient at Delmenhorst Hospital led to an investigation. Several colleagues expressed concern that he might be responsible for a number of unexplained complications, resuscitations, and deaths at the hospital. He was even caught manipulating a patient's syringe to administer ajmaline. A thorough investigation was then led into all deaths at the hospital between 2003 and 2005, and that revealed that the number of deaths had more than doubled during Hogel's employment. In fact, 73% of deaths during this period could be linked to his work schedule. These findings were presented to the Oldenburg District Attorney's Office, and in December 2006, Hogel was sentenced to 5 years in prison and a lifetime employment ban for attempted manslaughter. However, a higher court would then overturn this verdict, only to give it again in June 2008, where he was given a 7.5-year prison sentence and a lifetime employment ban. Trust me, I know exactly what you're thinking. This does not seem like enough. For someone to act the way that they did, only to get 7.5 years in prison, is a ridiculously low sentence. But bear with me, we're not done. Hogel was initially convicted of attempted manslaughter, which we mentioned. But he was later given the longer sentence of 7.5 years. But it wasn't until 2014 that the full extent of his crimes became apparent. He was convicted, he confessed to killing 30 patients, but later admitted to having killed at least 106. Hogel's motive was a twisted desire for recognition. He would administer excessive doses of medications to patients, then revive them to impress his colleagues. His actions caused cardiac arrhythmia and a severe drop in blood pressure, leading to deaths of many innocent people. Despite his crimes being uncovered, Hogel was never given the death penalty because it's illegal in Germany, but he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And probably one of the only good things that came out of this case was the increased scrutiny of hospital practices in Germany and a push for stricter regulations to prevent similar tragedies from happening. So, in conclusion here, as I mentioned, I could do this for hours. We have so many that I have gone through and sifted through, but unfortunately, we just don't have the time. And perhaps I'll do a part 2 later, but it would be nice to wrap this all up into a tight little bow. But as you can see from the historical examples, pinpointing specific motivations for medical professionals who kill can be difficult. There are those who kill for profit, those who kill because they can, those who do it for attention, those who do it to get out of a bind, and so many other reasons. So there's a few things I would like you to take from this discussion. First and foremost is that not all doctors are like this. I cannot say that enough. Not all doctors are killers, not all doctors harm, not all doctors swindle. These are outliers, and these are individuals who do not represent the vast majority. That being said, you do never know who is lurking in the shadows, in the background. So it's important to stay vigilant. They say, see something, report it. You probably should. If you suspect harm or wrongdoing, that's important as well. So again, as I mentioned, I might do a part 2 on this as there were so many to sift through, but we shall see about that going forward. So I want to take a second here. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I see there's some here. Yes, Charles Dickens was the gentleman from the Christmas Carol. He's the one who wrote A Christmas Carol. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat now, and I will answer as best as I can. But while I am waiting for that, I want to first and foremost thank you all for participating in this webinar. We had a great response to this, and we have quite a nice turnout. So I want to thank you all for taking the time to listen to this presentation. It's through individuals like you that we are able to continue doing this kind of stuff. We are an educational institution, so education is important to us. Even though this might seem a little weird where education is concerned, but we were looking at the motivations of deadly doctors and why they did what they did. So I also want to give a special thank you to everyone who donated to support the museum during the registration. We, again, are a charity. We're a nonprofit, so we are reliant on donations. So a special thank you goes out to all of you who donated. It doesn't look like we have any questions, but if you do have any going forward, please feel free to email me. It is info@lancastermedicalheritagemuseum.org, and I'd be happy to answer those questions. As it was This is the last Lunch and Learn for the year. I mentioned previously, if you have any ideas for a Lunch and Learn or a lecture that you are interested in, please feel free to reach out, and we can talk about scheduling that. So I hope everybody enjoyed that, and I really enjoyed giving it. It is a topic to thank you, Alan. Apparently everybody's very interested in a part 2. I want to thank you all for taking the time to listen to this. This topic is something I find fascinating. This one is basically just for me, as I find it fascinating, and I'm glad to see a lot of you do as well. So thank you all. And if you have any further questions, again, feel free to reach out. Have a great rest of your day and enjoy the sunshine that's today, the nice cool weather. So thank you all.